The Dubois family, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in their home city, had always been known for their lavish lifestyle and penchant for unique experiences. Their grand estates, luxury cars, and high-profile events were frequent topics of local tabloids. However, behind the glitz and glamour lay a family seeking a more profound connection, both with one another and with the world beyond their privileged bubble. It was this yearning for something authentic, raw, and untamed that led James Du Bois, the family patriarch, to suggest an adventurous holiday in the Amazon rainforest. A self-made billionaire in the tech investment industry, James had long prided himself on his ability to plan meticulously and execute flawlessly, whether in business or in family matters. For him, this trip was not just a vacation. It was a carefully curated opportunity to introduce his wife, Celeste, and their 10-year-old daughter, Amelia, to the wonders of the natural world, a stark contrast to their urban, hypermodern existence. Celeste, a former model turned philanthropist, had her reservations about venturing so far from the comforts of their estate. Used to her luxurious routines and the predictable rhythm of high society events, she initially balked at the idea of trading fine dining for campfire meals and state-of-the-art bathrooms for rustic lodges. But James's enthusiasm proved contagious, and soon, even Celeste began to warm to the idea of experiencing the legendary Amazon River and its unparalleled biodiversity. For their daughter, Amelia, the prospect of exploring a mysterious rainforest teeming with exotic animals, vibrant plants, and tales of adventure was nothing short of thrilling. A curious and imaginative child, Amelia spent weeks before the trip reading books about the Amazon, dreaming of encounters with parrots, sloths, and possibly even jaguars. The family's journey began with a kind of grandeur befitting their status. A private jet carried them from their city to a remote airstrip near the rainforest. From there, a luxury motorboat whisked them down a tributary of the Amazon River, its sleek design and polished wood interiors contrasting sharply with the untamed wilderness surrounding them. As the boat cut through the water, Amelia pressed her nose against the window, her wide eyes drinking in the sight of dense green canopies, flocks of colorful birds, and the occasional splash of river dolphins breaking the surface. James, ever the planner, reviewed their itinerary with the lodge staff, ensuring every detail was accounted for, from guided excursions to gourmet meals tailored to their tastes. Their destination was an eco-lodge, an architectural marvel designed to blend seamlessly into the rainforest. Built on stilts to protect against flooding, the lodge featured open-air living spaces, panoramic views of the jungle, and all the modern amenities the Du Bois family could need. Despite its luxurious trappings, the lodge operated sustainably, using solar power and locally sourced materials, a feature that James, a staunch advocate of green technology, found particularly appealing. Each day was carefully organized by a team of expert guides who promised the family a blend of adventure and safety, from canopy walks that offered a bird's-eye view of the forest to boat rides that navigated the winding waterways of the river. Amelia, however, was most drawn to the river itself. Its sheer size and beauty captivated her imagination, its waters shimmering in the sunlight like a silver ribbon winding through the dense green heart of the jungle. While her parents were content to observe from the safety of the lodge's decks, Amelia yearned to experience the river up close. She begged for opportunities to swim in its shallows, her innocent enthusiasm temporarily overriding her parents' caution. Though hesitant, James and Celeste eventually relented, allowing her to wade into designated safe areas under the watchful eye of the guides. Unbeknownst to the family, their arrival in the region had not gone unnoticed. In a small riverside village not far from the eco-lodge lived Pedro, a 7-year-old orphan who had grown up navigating the challenges of the rainforest. Pedro had lost his parents to a tragic river accident when he was just a toddler, leaving him to be raised by the tight-knit but impoverished community. Resourceful and resilient, Pedro knew the rainforest like the back of his hand, understanding its rhythms, dangers, and secrets in a way no guidebook could teach. Despite his hardships, Pedro was a cheerful and curious child, often exploring the riverbanks and observing the rare tourists who passed through the area. When he first caught sight of the Du Bois family with their clean clothes and high-tech gadgets, he was both awestruck and intrigued. To him, they seemed like characters from a storybook, completely foreign yet fascinating. Amelia's curiosity about the forest soon pushed the boundaries of the rules her parents had set. While they insisted she stay within sight of the lodge staff, she often wandered just a little farther, drawn by the sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the promise of adventure. One sunny afternoon, during a guided exploration of the riverbank, Amelia discovered a secluded bend in the river. The water there was calm and inviting, its surface sparkling like liquid gold under the dappled sunlight filtering through the dense canopy above. She begged to stay and explore, her parents reluctantly agreeing to let her dip her feet into the shallows under the guide's supervision. But Amelia's adventurous spirit knew no bounds, and she began wading further into the water, mesmerized by the fish darting around her feet and the sheer tranquility of the scene. Pedro, who had been quietly observing from the cover of the trees, watched with growing concern. He knew that the Amazon River, while beautiful, was also home to countless dangers hidden beneath its surface, dangers that even experienced locals approach with caution. Yet the young girl seemed blissfully unaware, her laughter echoing across the water as she splashed and played. Pedro's instincts, honed by years of survival in this unforgiving environment, told him that trouble was brewing. Little did anyone know, the tranquil moment by the river would soon give way to a life-altering event, one that would test the courage, instincts, and humanity of everyone involved. The midday sun cast its golden light across the Amazon River, illuminating its surface with a shimmering brilliance that made the water appear almost magical. Amelia stood waist-deep in the river, her laughter echoing through the forest as she splashed playfully, utterly enthralled by the moment. The river was alive with activity, from a small, curious fish that darted around her feet to the vibrant chorus of bird calls that filled the canopy above. It felt like paradise, untouched, serene, and enchanting. Her parents, James and Celeste, watched from the riverbank alongside their guide, a local expert who had assured them that this particular bend of the river was safe. Their initial unease about letting Amelia into the water had given way to reluctant approval, and now they observed with a mixture of indulgence and pride as their daughter reveled in the kind of joy only childhood could bring. But beneath the surface, the illusion of tranquility was about to shatter. In the murky depths of the river, a large crocodile lay in wait, perfectly still and almost invisible against the muddy riverbed. The creature was a master of patience, its cold, calculating instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. It had sensed Amelia's presence the moment she entered the water, its sensitive snout detecting the vibrations of her movements. Slowly and deliberately, the crocodile began to close the distance, its powerful tail propelling it forward with minimal effort. For now, it remained hidden, a shadow blending seamlessly with the currents, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Pedro, the 7-year-old orphan from the nearby village, had been watching the scene unfold from the dense foliage of the riverbank. He was accustomed to observing tourists like the Dubois family, wealthy, carefree, and often unaware of the dangers that lurked in the rainforest. Pedro's sharp eyes and instincts, however, had already noticed something was wrong. The river seemed too quiet. The fish that usually swarmed in these shallows had vanished, and the birds overhead were oddly silent. Years of surviving in the Amazon had taught Pedro to read these subtle signs, and his heart sank as he caught sight of a faint ripple moving against the current, a telltale indication of a predator. Amelia, oblivious to the approaching danger, waited a little farther from the shore, her focus on a school of brightly colored fish that darted around her legs. She giggled as she tried to catch one with her hands, her movement splashing water into the air. James called out a reminder to stay close, his voice tinged with mild concern, but Amelia waved him off with a grin, confident in the safety promised by their guide. Pedro, however, knew better. His heart pounded as he recognized the shape of a crocodile's head breaking the surface for a brief moment before sinking back down. He had only seconds to act. Without hesitation, Pedro bolted from his hiding spot, his small frame moving with surprising speed and urgency. His voice, high-pitched and filled with alarm, carried across the river as he shouted in his native tongue. The Dubois family and their guide turned toward the sound, their faces a mixture of confusion and growing fear as they tried to understand the boy's frantic gestures. Pedro shouted again, pointing to the water just behind Amelia, and this time the guide understood. His face went pale as he registered the danger, grabbing a whistle from around his neck and blowing it sharply to alert anyone within earshot. James and Celeste sprang to their feet, their shouts overlapping as they called out to Amelia. But their daughter, startled by the sudden commotion, froze in place. Her eyes widened as she saw the crocodile's massive form break the surface, its gaping jaws revealing rows of sharp, bone-crushing teeth. Time seemed to slow as the predator lunged forward, creating a surge of water that sent ripples crashing against the shore. Pedro reached the water's edge just as the crocodile closed in on Amelia. Without a moment's hesitation, he dove into the river, his small body cutting through the current with practiced ease. Amelia stood rooted in terror, unable to move as the predator bore down on her. Pedro grabbed her arm with surprising strength, his voice urgent as he yelled at her to follow him. Though she couldn't understand his words, Amelia instinctively clung to him, her survival instincts overriding her shock. The crocodile, undeterred, continued its pursuit, its powerful tail propelling it through the water with terrifying speed. Pedro, despite his size, used his intimate knowledge of the river to guide Amelia toward a cluster of submerged tree roots. These roots, tangled and gnarled, offered a natural barrier that could slow the predator's advance. "Climb," he shouted, gesturing for Amelia to pull herself onto the roots. Trembling and crying, she obeyed, scrambling onto the slippery wood as Pedro turned to face the crocodile. Armed with nothing but a long, sturdy stick he had grabbed from the riverbank, Pedro began striking the water with all his might. The loud splashes and vibrations momentarily confused the crocodile, which hesitated, its instincts telling it to reassess the situation. Pedro shouted and waved the stick, his defiance far outweighing his small stature. The crocodile lunged once more, snapping its jaws just inches from Pedro's legs. But the boy managed to dodge, his agility honed by years of navigating the rainforest challenges. From the shore, James and Celeste watched in horror, their helplessness etched across their faces. The guide, frantically shouting into his radio for backup, motioned for the family to stay put as he searched for something, anything that could be used as a weapon. Meanwhile, Pedro continued his standoff with the crocodile, his determination unwavering despite the odds. After what felt like an eternity, the predator finally relented, its prehistoric mind calculating that the effort was not worth the risk. With a final menacing snap of its jaws, it turned and disappeared back into the depths of the river. Amelia sobbed uncontrollably as Pedro climbed onto the tree roots beside her, his small hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. "It's okay," he said softly in his native language, though he knew she couldn't understand. From the riverbank, James, no longer able to contain himself, waded into the water to retrieve his daughter. Celeste collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she watched James carry Amelia back to safety, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Pedro followed silently, his clothes soaked and his face pale but resolute. The guide, recognizing the enormity of what the boy had just done, knelt down to speak to him in the local dialect. Pedro answered humbly, shrugging off the praise as though his actions were nothing extraordinary. Amelia, now back on solid ground, turned to look at the boy who had saved her life. Though her voice was choked with tears, her eyes conveyed a profound gratitude. For the first time in her young life, Amelia understood what it meant to owe someone everything. The chaos of the encounter began to subside as the crocodile retreated, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The air was thick with tension, and the Dubois family stood on the riverbank, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Amelia clung to her father's neck, her small body trembling uncontrollably as tears streaked her cheeks. Celeste knelt on the ground nearby, her face pale and her eyes glistening with relief and horror. Pedro stood a few feet away, his clothes dripping wet, his chest heaving with exertion, and his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Despite the danger having passed, the gravity of what had just occurred hung heavily over the group, each of them processing the event in their own way. James, usually composed and methodical, struggled to contain his emotions. His arms tightened protectively around Amelia as he whispered soothing words, though his own voice shook with fear. He kept glancing at Pedro, a deep gratitude welling up in his chest as he realized how close they had come to losing their daughter. Celeste, meanwhile, crawled to Amelia's side, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch her daughter's tear-streaked face. "You're safe now, darling," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's over. You're safe." The guide, who had been calling for assistance on his radio, approached Pedro, speaking to him in hurried, reverent tones. Pedro, though visibly shaken, answered softly, his word humble and unassuming. He glanced at Amelia, concern still evident in his young face. Despite his small stature and youthful appearance, Pedro's actions had revealed a bravery and maturity far beyond his years. For a moment, he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention, his gaze dropping to the muddy ground as the guide translated his words for the Dubois family. "He says he saw the crocodile before anyone else did," the guide explained, his voice filled with admiration. He knew what it was and what it intended. If he hadn't acted when he did, the guide trailed off, his meaning clear. James and Celeste exchanged a glance, the enormity of Pedro's actions sinking in fully. Without hesitation, James stepped forward, still holding Amelia in one arm, and extended his free hand to Pedro. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her life." Pedro hesitated for a moment, then took James's hand in a small but firm grip. Though he didn't fully understand the words, the sincerity in James's tone was unmistakable. Amelia, still trembling, turned to look at Pedro, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with genuine emotion. Pedro gave her a shy smile, his own fear and relief mirrored in her expression. As the initial shock wore off, the Dubois family's focus shifted to Pedro. Who was this boy, they wondered, and how had he come to be in the right place at the right time? The guide explained that Pedro was a local orphan, well known in the nearby village for his resourcefulness and bravery. He lost his parents when he was very young, the guide said, his voice tinged with sadness. But he has survived on his own ever since. He knows this river better than anyone. Hearing this, Celeste's heart ached. She looked at Pedro, standing barefoot and soaked to the skin, his small frame appearing even more fragile now that the danger had passed. Despite his rough circumstances, there was a quiet dignity about him, a strength born of hardship and resilience. "He's just a child," Celeste murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "And yet, he saved our daughter." The family insisted on bringing Pedro back to the lodge with them, not only to thank him properly, but also to ensure he was cared for after his harrowing act of heroism. At first, Pedro resisted, shaking his head and motioning toward the dense forest, where his village lay hidden. He seemed reluctant to leave the familiarity of his world, even for a short time. But Amelia, still clutching her father's hand, reached out to Pedro, her small fingers brushing his arm. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Come with us." Pedro looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers for a moment before he nodded. Together, the group made their way back to the lodge, Amelia and Pedro walking side by side. Though neither spoke much, an unspoken bond had already begun to form between them, forged in the crucible of danger and survival. Amelia, usually a chatterbox, remained quiet, her gaze darting occasionally toward Pedro, who walked with a calm but wary demeanor. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had done, how he had risked his life for hers without hesitation. In her young mind, Pedro had become a figure of awe and admiration, a hero unlike any she had ever imagined. When they arrived at the lodge, the staff, already alerted by the guide's radio call, rushed out to meet them. There was a flurry of activity as everyone worked to ensure Amelia and Pedro were safe and comfortable. Amelia was wrapped in a warm blanket and given a cup of sweet tea to calm her nerves. Pedro, though initially overwhelmed by the attention, was treated with equal care, his wet clothes replaced with dry ones borrowed from the staff. He sat quietly, his small hands clutching a steaming cup of tea, as the adults around him marveled at his bravery. Over the next few hours, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest came alive with the sounds of the night, Amelia and Pedro began to interact more freely. Amelia, her initial shyness giving way to curiosity, asked him questions about the forest, using the guide as a translator. Pedro, though reserved, answered patiently, describing the animals, plants, and dangers he had come to know so intimately. Amelia listened with rapt attention, her fear slowly being replaced by fascination. In turn, she told him about her life in the city, though she quickly realized how different their worlds were. Yet, despite their differences, a sense of connection began to grow between them, a mutual respect and understanding that transcended language and circumstance. James and Celeste watched their daughter and Pedro with a mixture of gratitude and introspection. The experience had shaken them to their core, forcing them to confront the fragility of life and the courage of an unlikely hero. They knew they owed Pedro a debt they could never fully repay, and as they observed the bond forming between him and Amelia, they began to wonder how they could support the boy who had saved their family from unimaginable loss. The days following the dramatic rescue unfolded with an air of reflection and discovery for the Dubois family. After the immediate danger had passed and Amelia was safely back at the lodge, the family couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had saved her life. Pedro, with his unassuming demeanor and quiet resilience, became a central figure in their conversations. For Amelia, he was no less than a hero, and for James and Celeste, he was a living reminder of the courage and resourcefulness that existed in the world beyond their privileged lives. The lodge staff, now fully aware of what had transpired, treated Pedro with immense respect, ensuring he was well fed and comfortable. Though he was initially wary of all the attention, Pedro began to relax as the days went by, realizing that the Dubois family and the staff meant him no harm. For the first time in a long while, he experienced a semblance of care and comfort that was foreign to his usual existence. But Pedro's humility and sense of responsibility never wavered. He often glanced toward the edge of the forest, as if to remind himself of the life he had temporarily left behind. Amelia, still shaken but recovering, spent most of her time with Pedro, often trailing behind him with wide-eyed curiosity as he navigated the lodge grounds. She asked him endless questions about the rainforest, how he had known the crocodile was there, how he had learned to swim so well, and whether he was ever afraid. Through the guide's translations, Pedro answered her questions patiently, though his responses were often short and modest. "The river tells you things," he explained once, pointing to the water. "If you listen, you'll know when something is wrong." Despite their language barrier, a bond began to form between Amelia and Pedro. She was fascinated by his world, a life so vastly different from her own. While she was used to soft beds, warm meals, and a sense of security, Pedro had grown up in a world where survival was a daily challenge. Yet, despite his hardships, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that Amelia couldn't help but admire. In turn, Pedro seemed to appreciate Amelia's genuine interest in his life. Though he wasn't used to being the center of attention, he found himself warming to her curiosity and kindness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lodge's lanterns cast a soft glow over the gathering area, James and Celeste asked the guide to help them learn more about Pedro's story. They had heard bits and pieces, how he was an orphan, how he lived on the fringes of a small village near the river, but they wanted to understand the boy who had risked his life for their daughter. The guide sat with Pedro, gently coaxing him to share more about himself. At first, Pedro hesitated, his dark eyes flickering with a mix of caution and vulnerability. But as he began to speak, his voice steady but soft, the story of his life unfolded. Pedro's parents had been fishers, living off the bounty of the river and the forest. Though their lives had been humble, they had been happy, finding joy in the simple rhythm of life by the water. But when Pedro was just a toddler, tragedy struck. During a routine fishing trip, his parents' canoe had capsized in a sudden storm, and neither had survived. Pedro, who had been left in the care of a neighbor that day, was too young to fully understand what had happened. By the time he realized his parents weren't coming back, he had already been taken in by the village, a community that cared for him but struggled to provide for its own. As Pedro grew, he learned to fend for himself, relying on the knowledge passed down by his parents and the villagers. He became adept at fishing, foraging, and navigating the unpredictable waters of the Amazon. Though his life was hard, Pedro rarely complained, finding solace in the beauty of the forest and the sense of freedom it offered. Yet his existence was undeniably lonely. Without a family of his own, he often wandered the riverbanks, observing the rare tourists who ventured into the region. He had never interacted with any of them until the day he saw Amelia in danger. As Pedro's story unfolded, James and Celeste listened intently, their hearts aching for the boy who had endured so much at such a young age. They exchanged glances, their unspoken thoughts reflected in each other's eyes. Here was a child who had not only survived unimaginable loss, but had also displayed extraordinary courage and selflessness. How could they ever repay him? How could they ensure that his future was brighter than his past? Amelia, who had been sitting quietly throughout Pedro's story, finally spoke up. "He's amazing," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "He's the bravest person I've ever met." Pedro glanced at her, his shy smile returning for a brief moment before he looked away. Amelia's words hung in the air, a testament to the bond that had grown between the two children in such a short time. Over the next few days, the Dubois family found themselves drawn deeper into Pedro's world. With his help, they explored parts of the rainforest they never would have dared venture into alone. Pedro showed Amelia how to identify edible fruits, how to spot the tracks of animals, and how to listen for the subtle warnings of the forest. In return, Amelia shared her own world with Pedro, telling him stories about her school, her home, and the things she loved. Though Pedro didn't say much in response, his attentive gaze made it clear that he was listening, taking in every word. James and Celeste, meanwhile, began to discuss how they could help Pedro. They spoke with the guide and the lodge staff, trying to understand what options might be available to support him. The idea of adopting Pedro crossed their minds more than once, but they hesitated, aware of the complexities such a decision would entail. They didn't want to uproot him from the only world he had ever known, but they also couldn't bear the thought of leaving him to face his hardships alone. One evening, as the family sat with Pedro by the river, James broached the subject gently. "Pedro," he began with the guide translating, "you've done something incredible for our family. We want to help you. Is there anything you need? Anything we can do for you?" Pedro looked at James, his expression thoughtful. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't need much," he said simply. "But if you want to help, you can help my village. The people there, they need more than I do." James and Celeste were struck by Pedro's response. Even in the face of their generosity, his thoughts were with others, not himself. It was a testament to the boy's character, and it solidified their resolve to do something meaningful for him and his community. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the Dubois family made a silent promise. They would find a way to repay Pedro, not just for saving Amelia's life, but for reminding them of the strength and beauty of the human spirit. As the days passed, the Dubois family's gratitude for Pedro's bravery grew into a deeper sense of responsibility. Saving Amelia's life was no small feat, but what struck James and Celeste even more was Pedro's humility and selflessness. Here was a boy who had faced immense hardship, yet his thoughts remained with his community rather than himself. For a family accustomed to a life of luxury and abundance, Pedro's actions and character were a stark reminder of the resilience and kindness that often came from those with the least. James, ever the planner, began discussing options with Celeste. Both agreed that they couldn't leave Pedro and his village in the same circumstances they had found them. Amelia, who had grown inseparable from Pedro during their time at the lodge, added her voice to the conversation. "We have to help him," she insisted, her tone unusually serious for a 10-year-old. "He saved my life, and he helps everyone in his village. We can't just leave him like this." The family started by gathering information from the guide and the lodge staff, who had deep connections to the surrounding villages. Through these conversations, they learned about the hardships Pedro's community faced. The village was small and isolated, relying heavily on the river for food and trade. Education was limited to a makeshift school with few resources, and access to medical care was almost non-existent. The villagers lived day to day, their survival tied to the unpredictable rhythms of the Amazon. James and Celeste were both struck by the disparity between their world and Pedro's. They had always believed in philanthropy, but this situation felt personal, a chance to make a tangible difference in the lives of people who had given so much to protect their family. One evening, the family invited Pedro to join them for dinner, an opportunity to talk about their plans. With the guide translating, James began carefully. "Pedro, we've been thinking a lot about how we can help you and your village. You've done so much for us, and we want to give something back. Would you let us help?" Pedro, seated at the table with an air of quiet humility, looked at James thoughtfully. "You don't need to help me," he said, his voice steady but soft. "But if you want to help, there are things my village needs. The school is small, and we don't have enough books. The fishermen need better nets. And sometimes when people get sick, there's no way to help them." Amelia, sitting beside Pedro, looked at him with wide eyes. "What about you?" she asked. "Isn't there something you need?" Pedro hesitated, glancing at the guide as if searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "I'm fine. I've lived like this my whole life. But the village, they've always helped me. If you help them, that's enough for me." James and Celeste exchanged a glance, their decision solidifying in their minds. "We'll do both," James said firmly. "We'll help the village, and we'll help you too." Pedro looked at him in surprise, his dark eyes reflecting both gratitude and uncertainty. He wasn't used to being the focus of such attention, and the idea of receiving help for himself was almost foreign. But he nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in James's voice. The next day, James and Celeste began making plans in earnest. They spoke with the lodge manager and the guide, outlining their intentions and seeking advice on the best ways to support Pedro's village. James, ever the strategist, proposed a multifaceted approach. "We'll start by addressing their immediate needs," he explained to Celeste. "Books and supplies for the school, better fishing equipment, and a partnership with a medical charity to provide health care. Then we'll look at long-term solutions, maybe a solar power system for the village or a more permanent medical facility." Celeste nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. Her background in philanthropy had given her experience in organizing charitable efforts, but this felt different, more personal. "We'll need to speak with the village leaders," she said. "We can't just impose our ideas on them. We have to make sure this is what they want." With the guide help, the Dubois family arranged a meeting with the elders of Pedro's village. The journey to the village was both challenging and eye-opening. As they traveled along the river in a small boat, they passed scenes of stunning natural beauty interspersed with glimpses of the villagers' lives. Children playing by the water, women washing clothes, and men repairing fishing nets. For Amelia, it was a world unlike anything she had ever known, and her admiration for Pedro grew with every passing moment. When they arrived, the villagers greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and warmth. Pedro was clearly well-loved, and the sight of him returning with a foreign family sparked a wave of excitement. The elders welcomed the Dubois family into the heart of the village, a modest clearing surrounded by simple wooden homes. James, with the guide translating, explained their purpose. "We've come to thank Pedro for what he did for our family," he began. "And we want to help the village in any way we can." The elders listened carefully, their expressions thoughtful. When James outlined their proposed initiatives, educational supplies, fishing equipment, and medical aid, they nodded in agreement. "These are things we need," one elder said. "But more than that, we need to know that our children have a future. If you can't help us with that, we will always be grateful." Moved by their words, James and Celeste promised to do everything in their power to support the village. Over the next several days, they worked with the villagers to identify specific needs and make detailed plans. James began contacting organizations and suppliers, leveraging his vast network to arrange for donations and resources. Celeste, meanwhile, connected with a medical charity that specialized in remote areas, arranging for a mobile clinic to visit the village regularly. Amelia, eager to help, spent her time with the children, sharing her crayons and notebooks and teaching them songs she had learned at school. Through it all, Pedro remained at the center of their efforts. Though he tried to deflect attention, the villagers often reminded him of the role he had played in bringing the Dubois family to their aid. "You have always been brave, Pedro," one elder told him. "Now the world knows it too." By the time their trip came to an end, the Dubois family had not only laid the groundwork for meaningful change in Pedro's village, but had also forged a bond with Pedro that would last a lifetime. As they prepared to leave, James and Celeste spoke to Pedro one last time. "We're going back to our home," James said, "but this isn't goodbye. We'll keep helping, and we'll stay in touch. And if you ever need anything at all, you just let us know." Amelia hugged Pedro tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'll miss you," she said. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Pedro smiled, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "I'll miss you too," he replied softly. As the boat pulled away from the village, the Dubois family watched the villagers wave from the shore. Pedro stood among them, his small figure framed by the lush greenery of the forest. Though their worlds were vastly different, their lives had become intertwined in a way none of them could have imagined. Months had passed since the Dubois family returned from the Amazon, but the impact of their journey lingered in ways they could never have anticipated. The harrowing experience with a crocodile, Pedro's bravery, and the days spent immersing themselves in the life of his village had left an indelible mark on their hearts and minds. Though they had returned to the comfort of their luxurious estate, they found themselves profoundly changed. For the first time in years, James, Celeste, and Amelia felt deeply connected to something larger than their insulated world, a sense of purpose rooted in gratitude, humility, and responsibility. James, ever the problem solver, immediately began executing the plans they had discussed in the Amazon. Using his vast network of business contacts, he secured funding and resources to support Pedro's village. He worked tirelessly to arrange shipments of educational supplies, fishing equipment, and building materials, ensuring they reached the village through local organizations that understood the region's unique challenges. Celeste, drawing on her background in philanthropy, took the lead on coordinating with a medical charity they had partnered with, organizing visits from mobile clinics and providing basic health education for the villagers. Despite the logistical challenges, the Dubois family was relentless in their efforts, driven by the memory of Pedro's quiet courage and the warmth of the village that had welcomed them so openly. Letters and photos from the villagers soon began arriving, carried by guides and delivered through the charity workers. The images showed children holding new books and wearing broad smiles, fishermen with sturdy new nets pulling in larger catches, and the mobile clinic set up beneath the shade of the forest canopy. Each letter reaffirmed the family's commitment to continue their support. For Amelia, the experience had sparked a transformation of her own. Once preoccupied with the luxuries of her privileged life, she now found joy in simpler things and spoke constantly about Pedro and the village. Her school projects became centered on the Amazon rainforest, and she often organized charity drives among her classmates to collect supplies for the villagers. Her parents watched with pride as their daughter blossomed into a compassionate, thoughtful young girl, deeply aware of her ability to make a difference in the world. Amelia also kept in touch with Pedro through the letters facilitated by the charity workers. Though Pedro's letters were simple and often brief, each one carried a warmth that spoke volumes. He would write about life in the village, how the children loved their new school supplies, how the fishermen were grateful for the improved equipment, and how the mobile clinic had saved the life of a sick elder. Amelia would write back with stories of her own life, though she often felt her world paled in comparison to his. Still, their correspondence became a source of joy for both children, a reminder of the bond they had formed in the face of danger. Meanwhile, the villagers began to see tangible improvements in their daily lives. The educational supplies allowed the school to expand its curriculum, offering new opportunities for the children. The fishermen's improved gear led to larger catches, ensuring more food and a steady income for the community. And the regular visits from the mobile clinic addressed long-standing health issues, providing both immediate care and preventative measures. The villagers, once accustomed to scraping by, began to feel a renewed sense of hope and possibility. Pedro's life, too, underwent a transformation. Though he remained humble and grounded, he could not deny the changes that had come to the village and to himself because of the Dubois family's efforts. For the first time, he felt a sense of security that had been absent since the loss of his parents. The villagers, always supportive of him, now looked to him with a newfound respect, often calling him their young hero. But Pedro, ever modest, would simply shrug and say, "I just did what anyone would do." One day, a letter arrived from James and Celeste that would change Pedro's life yet again. In it, they proposed creating a scholarship fund in Pedro's name, offering him the opportunity to attend a prestigious school in the nearest city. They believed that education could open doors for him, giving him the tools to achieve his dreams while also enabling him to help his village in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The letter explained that the choice was entirely his to make. If he wanted to stay in the village, they would continue to support him there. But if he wished to pursue education, they would ensure every detail was arranged, from housing to school supplies to transportation. Pedro was overwhelmed by the offer. Though he had always been curious about the world beyond the village, the thought of leaving the only home he had ever known filled him with uncertainty. He spent days pondering the decision, seeking advice from the elders, and reflecting on what it would mean for his future. In the end, it was Amelia's latest letter that helped him decide. In it, she wrote about her dreams of becoming an environmental scientist, inspired by their shared experiences in the rainforest. "I think we can both make a difference," she wrote. You in your way, and me in mine. With those words in mind, Pedro made his decision. He would accept the scholarship, not for himself alone, but for his village and the people who had always supported him. He wrote back to James and Celeste, expressing his gratitude and his hope that he could make them proud. The family immediately sprang into action, coordinating with local organizations to ensure Pedro's transition to city life was as smooth as possible. When the day came for Pedro to leave the village, the entire community gathered to see him off. Though the goodbyes were emotional, there was an undercurrent of pride and hope among the villagers. "You're one of us," an elder told Pedro, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But now you'll carry our story into the world. Never forget where you came from." Pedro nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. He carried those words with him as he boarded the small boat that would take him to the city, waving to the villagers until they disappeared from view. His journey had begun, and though he didn't yet know what the future held, he felt ready to face it with the same courage that had saved Amelia on that fateful day. For the Dubois family, Pedro's departure marked the continuation of a journey they were all part of. They remained deeply involved in the village, ensuring that the progress they had started would be sustainable for years to come. Amelia, more determined than ever, continued to advocate for the Amazon rainforest, raising awareness among her peers and dreaming of the day she could return to visit Pedro and the villagers who would become like family. As the years went by, Pedro flourished in his new environment, excelling in his studies and earning the admiration of his teachers and peers. He never forgot his roots, riding often to the village and the Dubois family, sharing his achievements and thanking them for their unwavering support. The bond between Pedro and Amelia remained strong, their letters evolving from childhood stories to shared dreams of making the world a better place. In the end, the story of Pedro and the Dubois family was not just one of survival, but of transformation. It was a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and connection, proof that even in the most unlikely circumstances, lives can intersect in ways that change them forever.